Hi, today I want to talk about the crisis in the cybersecurity industry. Now, what crisis, you may be asking? Well, it's a crisis of risk management. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that many people in the cybersecurity industry are misunderstanding what cyber risk is, or indeed what risk management is. So just to give you an example, let me show you a big well-known company. I'm not going to pick on them alone, it's just using them as an example for education purposes, but they're far from alone in making this mistake. Let's look at IBM. So here they've got what is cyber risk management. They define cyber risk management as the process of identifying, prioritizing, managing and monitoring risks to information systems. Now, why is that such a big problem? Surely that is what cybersecurity risk is. Well, it's not according to official definitions, not according to the UK government. That is not what risk is, or risk management is. And just as I said, IBM are not alone in making this mistake. Let's look at another company. Here's Thales, a major French defence supplier, also in the UK and internationally. Here they talk about risk and threat evaluation. And they say, what is risk management here? And they have some icons at the bottom of the screen. You say, protect your information assets from cyber attacks and data breaches. Again, that is not what risk evaluation, risk and threat evaluation starts with. So they're getting it wrong. So if you're not a cybersecurity expert, and the people who ought to be cybersecurity experts, or the people that you turn to for advice, are getting it wrong, what should you do? Well, this is why this is such a big crisis. Well, let's look now at actually, well, what can you do better? So the first thing to understand is that the English meaning of risk is different to the one we use for business and cyber security. And this to me is the root of many of the misunderstandings. So people take their own definition of risk because the industry hasn't matured enough so that the proper definition is completely embedded. And so people make it up from their own experience of what risk is and how you use it in common English. So for example, we see risks used as simply bad things. We see them as identified as danger. Hazards is another example of risk. We quite often see that in health and safety. Problems, again, if you ask people to fill in their risks on a project plan, you will see people listing their problems instead and saying the things that we haven't really resolved, questions that we've got. They're talking about risks as problems. And quite often in cybersecurity, they confuse risks with technical vulnerabilities. Now, each vulnerability is a problem, but it's not necessarily a risk. So what actually is a risk? Well, here's the definition according to the International Standards Organization, and specifically ISO 31000, which is all about identifying business risks. What is a risk? They define risk as the effect of uncertainty on outcomes. Now, outcomes are meant there in the business context. They're not simply the outcome of a bad thing happening to your information services or your information systems, as in the Thales definition or IBM's. It's the effect of uncertainty on what the business wants to achieve, on the outcomes that the business is trying to achieve. Greater profitability, reliability, brand trust, where governments can trust them with their data, for example. Now, you might say, well, I don't agree with that definition, but if you're supplying to government, which is probably about 1/4 of all spending in the UK, well, they have their own official definition in the HM Treasury Orange Book, which is used for assessing all business plans and is a very good example of a government standard that is excellent quality and really understands its subject. And it's also the underlying mechanism by which business cases are approved, which is the Green Book. So the Orange Book defines risk, again, similarly to the international standard. Risk is the effects of uncertainty on objectives. Now, they also go on to say risk is usually expressed in terms of causes, potential events, and their consequences. And I find that really useful because it's the "and" in that sentence that is really important. So it's not just causes, although causes are a part of risks. It's not just potential bad things that might happen to those weaknesses that you might have. It's those things plus the consequences, and that together makes up a risk. So what's going wrong in the cybersecurity industry as a whole is that people don't really understand the consequences of information systems going wrong, or they haven't fully articulated that. So they tend to focus on their comfort zone, and that's the causes and potential events. And that's why they quite often people in cybersecurity or security get frustrated with business people, and business people get frustrated with cybersecurity, because cybersecurity say we've got to spend all this money, we've got all these vulnerabilities, we've got to fix things. And yes, that might be true, but until it's expressed as a consequence to the business, usually in monetary form, then it's not really making sense to business. And you quite often see the anti-pattern of arbitrary budget being applied to cybersecurity. So I worked once for a UK government agency in the health sector, and they were getting sort of like 25% of what they were asking for on their budget. And that's because the management there said, well, we know that IT isn't very effective, or it's not as efficient as we want it to be. So to make them more efficient, we're only going to give them 25% of what they're asking for. Now, the business had no idea whether that 25% was the right number. The IT people couldn't express it as that. So I helped them in that example, for example, to express their cybersecurity risks in business terms. And that got a much more positive conversation going with management, and actually had the result of making them release much greater amounts of funding for cybersecurity, because they were starting to see how that related to the things that they thought were important as the management of that organization. So this is a real step forward, and this starts to identify why cybersecurity is actually so quite poor in some organizations, why cybersecurity is way behind. That old definition of cybersecurity, incidentally, is quite, the one that I showed by IBM and Thales, is really about 20 years out of date. When information systems were something in a silo in your organization, IT was non-business critical. In my first job many years ago, information systems were on the account floor. There was a computer, a big computer in its own room, and that was the information system. It wasn't intrinsic to the business. You could have lost that, and in fact that was a steelworker I was working for there. The manufacturing would still have carried on. Information that day and age was paper-based mostly, and things like that. So they're very separate things, the manufacturing systems and the accounting systems. Now, most businesses are information systems, even if they don't see themselves as such, especially though if you're operating in the modern world, providing modern systems, whether it's web services, services to government or defense systems or health services, you are an information business. So actually, that Thales definition, which I'll show you again, is not totally wrong. Protect your information assets from cyber breaches cyber attacks and data breaches, but it is not the whole story. What it really should say here on this is protect your business from cyber attacks and breaches. So how do you go about identifying what those business assets are and the business impacts that need to make a properly defined risk that includes vulnerabilities, threats to those vulnerabilities, and a business outcome or a lack of business outcome, depending whether it's positive or negative? Well, this is where our Cyber Design Accelerator comes in. I'll show you that now. This actually has 4 elements. A preparation process, which allows you to get going with risk management. This is all about setting the conditions for success in your project. And that can be whether you're a brand new project just getting going and you need to understand how much effort you're going to need to put in cybersecurity and why, or how much effort you don't need to put in, so actually you can save money, but identifying what your true business risks are. Secondly, having the agility to change. So cybersecurity is changing so much at the moment. 3 years ago, you had a month to respond to a new vulnerability that was published with 0 days notice. Now it's a matter of hours. So what was appropriate when your project started, especially if it's a big project like a piece of infrastructure, a bridge, a train system, or a new reservoir, might take decades to build. What was appropriate when the contract started may not be appropriate now, and you need to have the agility to respond to that, and you need a new type of contract and a new type of governance that enables you to do that. Finally, when you've got your system up and running, making sure that you focus on the right things. And that to me is what we call our GEMS safeguarding transformer. This is the bit that everybody feels is cybersecurity. It's controls. We've got it written there at the bottom. And actually the big mistake is jumping to this rather than having done the preparation work first. First of all, understanding what it is that your organization needs and why, or what your project needs. Secondly, measuring the right things so you've got the agility to respond to changes. And then you've got controls that are appropriate to your business. I will show you an example of how not to do that. And if we look at this slide here, you've got an example of, this is DEFSTAN 05138 issue 3. So it's hot off the press, updated last year, unfortunately. But it says it's risk-based proportionate approach. But then actually, there is no proportion. There is no mention of numbers. So this is an example of how not to do this. What should you do instead? Actually, you should go back to this GEMS safeguarding transformer and make sure your controls are properly based on quantified risks. And actually, this is following NCSC advice, National Cyber Security Centre advice, which says it's a myth that risks can't be quantified. So back in that DEFSTAN, where they've just done low, medium and high for their risks, and they've also conflated that with high classification and low classification, actually controls need to be based on the cost of that control versus the cost or benefit of the outcome. And then you've got a business case that writes itself, because management can see why they should spend money on that and why they shouldn't spend money. And it all comes from properly expressed risks. But the mistake is jumping to that before you've done the preparation work and governance. And finally, another mistake that people make is jumping to engineering. So I was recently talked about another actual defence client was approached us and said, oh, we want to write some secure engineering frameworks. And I said, well, that's great, really good that you want to do that, but why do you want to do that? Have you thought about what's important to your organisation? And if we write some really great frameworks and secure engineering systems, will people listen to them? Will they implement them? So unless you've got the organisational controls in place to make that happen, you're possibly wasting your time writing really great technical advice if nobody is motivated or incentivized to follow that. So finally, the engineering comes at the end, not at the beginning. It's after you've put all the right organizational controls in place that then you can really start cooking on gas with the right engineering and people actually start using it for live. So that's, for example, when you're doing zero trust. It's easy to write a policy on zero trust, but it will just gain dust on the shelf or in the virtual SharePoint or wherever it is these days. But actually, what really drives an organization towards zero trust is not just having those bright patterns in place, but actually having the organizational whys in place so that people are motivated to do it, and it becomes then a living document. And overall, that journey is your journey to secure by design. So if you'd like to learn more about how you can make your organization secure by design, how you can make risks work for your business rather than taking a legacy approach, please don't hesitate to get in touch.